June 22, 1941, minutes before one of the deadliest wars in human history begins. On the other side of the border, thousands of German soldiers are standing in silence. They were told this would be a short operation, a fast campaign, a march that would end in medals and promotions. But within hours, many of them would realize something had gone terribly wrong. Today, we look at June 22 not through Soviet eyes, but through the eyes of those who crossed the border with weapons in their hands. I believed time would erase these memories. Decades passed. My hands tremble now. My mind is slower. But some things never disappear. They return in silence and in dreams. In June 1941, I was a German soldier. We crossed into the Soviet Union, believing we were following orders, not knowing this march would lead us into disaster. June 22 became a day of mourning for millions. That morning, Nazi Germany launched a massive attack along the entire Soviet border, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. What began was not a campaign, but a war of annihilation. Much has been said about this day from the Soviet side, but very few ask a different question. What did it look like to the men who fired the first shots? In this film, you will hear what German soldiers rarely speak about: why the army was kept in the dark until the very last night, why early reports of an easy victory quickly turned into confusion, and which moments of June 22 became the first warning that Blitzkrieg might fail. By the evening of that day, German generals were still filing confident reports, but the soldiers already understood something else. This was not a campaign. This was the beginning of hell.
The decision to attack the Soviet Union was not made overnight, not in June, not even in the spring of 1941. In mid-December 1940, Adolf Hitler signed Directive Number 21, the plan that would later be known as Operation Barbarossa. This was not a theoretical document. It was an order for destruction. The directive stated clearly, the Soviet Union had to be defeated in a short campaign before the war with Britain was finished. Otherwise, Germany risked being dragged into a prolonged war on two fronts. But there was something unusual about this decision. Most of the army did not know. By January 1941, German divisions began moving east, mostly at night, without insignia, without explanation. At the end of the month, the High Command issued orders to concentrate troops near the Soviet border, officially for defensive purposes, in reality for invasion. Why keep the soldiers in the dark? Because Hitler feared not only the enemy, he feared doubt inside his own army. A war in the East was different, not France, not Poland. It meant distance, scale, and the risk of total collapse if things went wrong. So deception became policy. Troop movements were explained as preparations for an invasion of Britain. Others were told about operations in the Balkans or North Africa. The growing military presence in Poland and East Prussia was described as a defensive measure, protection against a possible Soviet attack. Even defensive fortifications were built along the border in early 1941, reinforcing the illusion. Everything suggested caution. In reality, the offensive machine was already moving. According to High Command instructions, officers were to be informed of the real objective only 8 days before the operation, non-commissioned officers and enlisted men just before the attack itself. As a result, hundreds of thousands of soldiers marched east without knowing that they were about to invade the Soviet Union. And this is why so many German memoirs begin with the same line: "We did not know where we were going." Modern war does not start suddenly. Even Blitzkrieg requires preparation. Divisions must be deployed, supply lines established, reserves positioned.
On June 10th, forces assigned to Barbarossa began moving into their concentration areas. Within days, first-line divisions occupied their attack positions. By June 20th, deployment was almost complete. Along the Soviet border stood one of the largest invasion forces in history. More than 180 divisions, millions of men, thousands of tanks and aircraft. An army already at war, but not yet told the truth. They moved east at night. During the day, they waited, in forests, on rail sidings, under camouflage nets. No unit markings, no maps explaining the destination, no clear orders. March discipline was strict. Letters home were forbidden. Discussions about routes and objectives were discouraged. In many cases, even junior officers knew little more than the men they commanded. And in that silence, rumors spread. Some believed Germany had reached an agreement with the Soviet Union, that the army would be allowed to pass through Soviet territory, south through the Caucasus, into Persia, and further toward Africa. Others were convinced this was preparation for a strike against Britain, or a massive training exercise meant to intimidate Moscow. The idea that Germany was about to attack the Soviet Union seemed unrealistic to many. Quote, "We marched for at least a week, only at night. Around June 20, we reached the Lithuanian border. We had no idea what awaited us. There were countless rumors. The thought that we would attack Russia never crossed our minds," recalled Lieutenant Gottfried Evert. Different units were told different stories. Some were informed they were being rested before an amphibious operation against Britain. Others heard about large-scale maneuvers. Some were told they were merely reinforcing the eastern frontier. This confusion was not accidental. It was organized. Hitler delayed the truth deliberately. He understood that once a soldier realized he was marching toward a war in the East, a war without clear limits, against an enormous and unknown enemy, morale would suffer. So reality was withheld until the last possible moment. Even when divisions were positioned just kilometers from the border, many soldiers still did not know who their enemy would be. They cleaned their weapons, checked their equipment, waited for orders, without knowing what those orders would bring. By June 20, one thing became clear. This was not an exercise. Too many troops, too much coordination, too precise a deployment. But certainty still did not exist. Not yet. Only hours later, the truth would finally be revealed. In the next chapter, we move away from the front lines to Germany itself, to the barracks, the homes, and the radio broadcasts, to the moment when one country became an enemy, literally, overnight.
In Germany, war with the Soviet Union was barely discussed, at least not openly. Official propaganda spoke of peace, of trade agreements, of stable relations in the East. After 1939, the Soviet Union was not presented as an enemy, certainly not as the next battlefield. For millions of Germans, the USSR was simply not a target of war. Quote, "I was a child, but it felt as if no one expected a war with the Soviet Union. It began suddenly. The USSR became an enemy overnight," recalled Wehrmacht soldier Fritz Wittmann. That sudden shift was no accident. German society had not been prepared psychologically, and neither had much of the army. Yes, some sensed what was coming. Some remembered Hitler's speeches about living space in the East. Others believed Bolshevism was an existential threat that would have to be destroyed sooner or later. But even among them, few believed the war would begin in the summer of 1941. After the Polish campaign, relations with Moscow cooled, but logic suggested a different sequence. First Britain, then everything else. A two-front war still looked like madness. Quote, "In 1941, the mood among the population was mixed. We felt that war was approaching, but there was no real enthusiasm," end quote, wrote Rupert Schillinger. Quote, "There was tension in the air. We did not think war would begin immediately. If anything, it seemed like a distant future," end quote. And then, suddenly, it was no longer distant. On the morning of June 22nd, radio broadcasts announced the beginning of war. No public debate, no warning, no transition. One day there was peace, the next, a crusade. Hitler's proclamation framed the invasion as a historic mission, a necessary struggle against world Bolshevism. Germany, its soldiers were told, was defending Europe itself. For civilians and soldiers alike, the shock was real. Yesterday's partner had become today's mortal enemy. This abrupt transformation mattered because it meant that millions entered the war without emotional preparation, without hatred carefully cultivated over time, and without a clear understanding of what lay ahead. They were stepping into something vast, violent, and irreversible, without fully realizing it. By the evening of June 21st, German units were already in position. The final barrier was not physical, it was psychological, and it was about to be removed.
June 21, 1941. Evening. Starting around 8 o'clock, units assigned to the first wave of the invasion were assembled and given a sealed order. This was the moment when uncertainty ended. War was no longer a rumor. The order was read aloud in a formal, almost ceremonial tone. It spoke of a historic mission, of a decisive campaign against Bolshevism, of Europe's future resting in the hands of the German soldier. It was framed as necessity, as destiny, as something that could no longer be avoided. Soldiers were told that the fate of Germany and of Europe itself now depended on them. The proclamation ended with an appeal to God, a blessing for what was about to begin. These words were spoken to men who, in a few hours, would be opening fire on sleeping cities, barracks, and airfields. Reactions varied. Some listened in silence, some felt excitement, others felt unease. But open doubt was rare, not because everyone believed, but because the machine was already in motion. We were soldiers. If we were ordered to fight, then we fought. There was no question of wanting or not wanting to, recalled a Wehrmacht infantryman years later. Many still believed the war would be short. Poland had collapsed quickly, France even faster. Why would the East be different? Officers reassured their men. The Red Army was poorly led, undisciplined, incapable of coordinated resistance. The campaign, they said, would be over in weeks. That night, forward units moved into final positions. Assault groups gathered near the border. Infantry waited in trenches. Artillery crews stood by their guns. Tank engines were warmed and ready. Airfields were filled with aircraft, fueled and armed. Everything had been calculated down to the minute. The time of attack was fixed, 3:15 a.m., not earlier, not later. Everything was ready, boats at the riverbank, guns in position, reserves deployed. We were simply waiting for the signal, remembered a German officer stationed near the frontier. That night, most soldiers still believed they were about to begin another victorious campaign. They did not yet know that by the next evening, their confidence would be shaken. 3:15 a.m., June 22, 1941. Silence ended instantly. Along the entire border, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea,
artillery opened fire at the same moment. A massive barrage rolled eastward, shattering the last minutes of peace. Even veterans of the First World War later admitted the intensity of this opening strike shocked them. Within minutes, the air filled with aircraft. Bombers crossed the border in waves. Dozens of towns were hit, but the primary targets were clear. Barracks, headquarters, supply depots, airfields. The goal was simple: paralyze the Red Army before it could react. For the Wehrmacht, this was a rehearsed operation. Units had been on alert for days. Weapons were loaded. Boots were on. Orders were clear. For the Soviet side, it was different. Many soldiers woke up to explosions inside their barracks or field camps. Communication lines were cut. Commanders were killed in the first strikes. Orders never arrived. In the opening hours, huge quantities of ammunition and fuel were destroyed. Equipment was knocked out before it could be used. On airfields, hundreds of aircraft burned on the ground. The Luftwaffe quickly achieved air superiority. From the German perspective, everything seemed to be unfolding according to plan. But this was the point where expectations first began to crack. The Red Army did not collapse. Where the Udar was overwhelming, units were forced back. But wherever they could, they counterattacked. Encircled units did not surrender. They fought on. For German soldiers, this was unexpected. In Poland, resistance had broken quickly. In France, entire units had laid down their arms. Here, it was different. German formations began taking casualties within the first hours. The pace of the advance slowed. In some sectors, small but stubborn pockets of resistance blocked movement and disrupted plans. By midday, it was becoming clear this was not the war they had been promised. And the most striking example of that realization came from a place the Germans had expected to fall without difficulty.
The Brest fortress was not considered a serious obstacle. It was supposed to fall quickly, hours, not days. The assault was assigned to the 45th Infantry Division of the Wehrmacht, around 17,000 men. Inside the fortress stood a Soviet garrison of roughly 8,000, many of whom had already been killed or wounded by the initial artillery and airstrikes. On paper, the outcome seemed obvious. The first reports sounded confident: bridges secured, outer fortifications breached, resistance described as limited. But within hours, the tone began to change. 4:42 a.m., 50 prisoners taken, all in their underwear. The war had caught them in their beds. This was meant to confirm the success of surprise. But the situation did not stabilize, it deteriorated. 7:39 a.m. Soviet troops are fighting fiercely behind our forward units. Infantry, supported by armored vehicles trapped inside the fortress, has formed multiple strongpoints. 11:59 a.m. The battle for the fortress is extremely intense, heavy losses. For a division that had marched through Poland and France, this was unexpected. By the end of the day, the 45th Division had suffered more casualties than during the entire French campaign. The assault stalled. German units were forced to pull back beyond the outer ramparts and resume heavy artillery fire. The fortress did not fall in a day, nor in two. It was officially declared captured only a week later, and even then, isolated pockets of resistance continued to fight for nearly a month. For the Wehrmacht, this was incomprehensible. And Brest was not an isolated case. Along the entire front, German units encountered the same pattern. Soviet troops clung to fortified positions and towns until they were physically destroyed. One German corps commander summarized the situation bluntly: Soviet forces defend stubbornly. Positions can only be taken through deliberate attacks at the cost of heavy losses. This was the first day of the war, and already
German soldiers were facing an enemy who refused to behave as expected.
By the end of the first day, one realization spread quickly through German units. The Soviets were not surrendering. Not because they misunderstood the situation, but because they rejected it. The Wehrmacht was prepared for resistance, for casualties, for difficult fighting. What it was not prepared for was an enemy willing to fight until complete destruction. Encircled units did not lay down their weapons. When ammunition ran out, they attacked anyway. Wounded soldiers kept firing. Burning vehicles became firing positions. For an army accustomed to rapid collapses of enemy morale, this was a psychological shock. German diaries began to change almost immediately. We took almost no prisoners. The Russians fought to the last man. When they ran out of ammunition, they used rifle butts. If the rifle was knocked from their hands, they attacked with knives or bare fists. Diary of a Tank Crewman, Army Group Center. It was pure suicide, 5 men attacking a battalion, admitted a German battalion commander after one engagement. And yet, this is exactly what German units were encountering, again and again. What unsettled them was not numbers, it was determination. During one engagement, a light Soviet T-26 tank was knocked out by German anti-tank fire. As infantry approached the wreck, a Soviet tanker emerged from the turret and opened fire with a pistol. Later, it was discovered that both of his legs had been torn off by the explosion. He continued shooting anyway. From burning tanks, Russian crews keep firing at us until the very last moment, wrote an Obergefreiter of the 21st Panzer Regiment. This was the moment when many German soldiers felt something unfamiliar. Not admiration, not fear, but a heavy, unsettling understanding. They were not fighting just an army. They were fighting a people prepared to die rather than retreat. And that reality shattered every timetable. Yes, later there would be victories, encirclements, hundreds of thousands of prisoners. But on the first day of the war, there were almost none. And that fact alone made June 22 a day of silent alarm for the Wehrmacht. By the evening of June 22, it was clear that events on the ground did not match what had been drawn on the maps. German units had advanced, in some areas rapidly, in others only after hard fighting. But there was no sense of a defeated country. And this feeling was no longer limited to front-line soldiers. The first detailed reports began arriving at German headquarters. Their tone was noticeably different from the confident messages of the early morning. Chief of the General Staff, Franz Halder, noted the essential point. The Red Army had chosen to fight decisive battles directly in the border zone. Soviet units were withdrawing only under overwhelming pressure. Everywhere else, they fought to the last man. They looked for opportunities to strike the flanks. They tried to cut German tank spearheads off from the following infantry. In some sectors, the situation became so confused that it was no longer clear who was encircling whom. This was not the kind of resistance German planners had anticipated. There was no general panic, no total breakdown of command, no mass surrender. The Red Army absorbed the shock and began to react. This was not a Soviet assessment, it was a German one. The High Command of the Wehrmacht reached a similar conclusion. In its summary for June 22, the wording was cautious but revealing. After initial confusion, the enemy is offering increasingly stubborn resistance. For a doctrine built on speed and psychological collapse, this was a warning sign. Blitzkrieg depended on momentum, on fear, on the enemy losing the will to fight. And on the very first day,
that mechanism began to fail. By nightfall, German commanders were forced to admit something privately they would not say publicly. This was not a campaign. This was a war of endurance. This is how the first day of the war ended. Not with triumph, not with collapse, and not with the clean victory the planners had promised. June 22 became the day when two worlds collided and misunderstood each other completely. One world believed in Blitzkrieg, in speed, in technology, in discipline and superiority. The other world was fighting for its home, without calculations, without illusions, without the expectation of quick success. German generals were still submitting optimistic reports, marking advances on their maps, counting kilometers gained. But the soldiers already felt something was wrong. They did not feel as if they were moving through a defeated country. They did not see a broken enemy. They did not sense psychological dominance. Every town had to be taken by force. Every position had to be crushed. Every hour demanded blood. On that day, the Wehrmacht faced something it had not planned for. Not just an army, a people. A people for whom retreat meant destruction and resistance meant survival. On June 21, German soldiers believed they were beginning another campaign, another march toward medals and promotions. On June 22, many of them understood they had entered a war from which there would be no easy exit. This hell did not end near Moscow. It did not end at Stalingrad. It ended in Berlin. But it began here, at dawn on June 22, 1941. On the day Blitzkrieg cracked for the first time, on the day the story of defeat truly began, and the story of victory on the other side was born. One question remains. Why did the German leadership make such a fundamental mistake and underestimate their enemy so completely?